Hi, today we're going to read a fun story that is called Wombat Stew. It's by Marcia K. Vaughan and illustrated by Pamela Lofts. This story was written in Australia, so they use some words that we don't use here where we live, and I'll stop and I'll explain what those words are as we go along. They also have animals that are different than the animals that we have here, and we'll talk about those too. One day on the banks of a billabong, a very clever dingo caught a wombat. Now, do you know what a billabong is? A billabong is like a stream or a creek. And so he caught this wombat on the banks of the billabong. This is the dingo. A dingo is like a fox or a coyote or a dog of some sort. And this is the wombat. Actually, there's a better picture of him right there. A wombat is just another type of animal. So, one day on the banks of a billabong, a very clever dingo caught a wombat and decided to make wombat stew, gooey, brewy, yummy, chewy, wombat stew. See, there's the wombat. Platypus came ambling up the bank. This is the platypus. A platypus has a mouth like a duck and a tail like a beaver and fur like a beaver. Isn't that funny? This is platypus. Platypus came ambling up the bank. "Good day, Dingo," he said, snapping his bill. "What is all that water for?" "I'm brewing up a gooey, chewy stew with that fat wombat," replied Dingo with a toothy grin. "If you ask me," said Platypus, "the best thing for a gooey stew is mud. Big blops of Billabong mud." "Blops of mud?" Dingo laughed. "What a good idea! Right-o! In they go!" So Platypus scooped up big blops of mud with his tail and tipped them into the billy can. You know what a billy can is? That's the billy can. The billy can is the bucket that the wombat's using to make his stew. Do you think that blops of mud would go good in a stew? I don't either. Do you know what I think this platypus is doing? I think the platypus is playing a trick on the dingo and trying to make the stew nasty. Let's find out. Around the bubbling billy, Dingo danced and sang, wombat stew, gooey, brewy, yummy, chewy, wombat stew." Waltzing out from the shade of the ironbarks came Emu. That's Emu. An emu was like an ostrich. She arched her graceful neck over the brew. "Oh ho, Dingo," she fluttered, "what have we here?" "Gooey, chewy wombat stew," boasted Dingo. "If only it were a bit more chewy," she sighed, "but don't worry, a few feathers will set it right." "Feathers?" Dingo smiled. "That would be chewy. Right-o! In they go." So into the gooey brew Emu dropped her finest feathers. Do you think feathers would go good in a stew? I don't either. I think Emu is trying to trick the dingo also. I think they don't want him to eat the wombat. Around and around the bubbling billy, Dingo danced and sang, wombat stew, crunchy munchy for my lunchy, wombat stew." Old Blue Tongue the lizard came sliding off his sun-soaked stone. "Silly Dingo," he hissed, "there are no flies in this stew. Can't be wombat stew without crunchy flies in it." And he stuck out his bright blue tongue. "There's a lot to be said for flies," agreed Dingo, rubbing his paws together. "Right-o! In they go." So Lizard snapped 100 flies from the air with his long tongue and flipped them into the gooey, chewy stew. Would you want flies in your stew? I didn't think so. Around and around and around the bubbling billy, the dingo danced and sang, Wombat stew, crunchy munchy for my lunchy, wombat stew. Up through the red dust popped Echidna. Now that's an echidna. An echidna is a lot like the porcupines that we have here. Wait a bit, not so fast, he bristled, shaking the red dust from his quills. Now I've been listening to all this advice. And take it from me, for a munchy stew you need slugs and bugs and creepy crawlies. Would you want slugs and bugs and creepy crawlies in your stew? I wouldn't either. Dingo wagged his tail. Why, I should have thought of that. Right-o, in they go. So Echidna dug up all sorts of creepy crawlies and dropped them into the gooey, chewy, crunchy stew. This is my favorite picture of the whole book. I want to put it closer. Can you see the faces on those bugs? Look how scared they are about going into the stew. Look at that horrified look on their faces. You see, don't you love the pictures of those bugs going into the stew? The very clever Dingo stirred and stirred, all the while singing, Wombat stew, hot and spicy, oh so nicey, wombat stew. And look, here's the poor little wombat covering his ears because he does not want to be made into a stew. Just then, the sleepy-eyed koala climbed down the scribbly gum tree. And this is the koala, right there. Look here, he yawned. Any bush cook knows you can't make a spicy stew without gum nuts. Now, these are gum nuts, and I've never seen a gum nut in real life, but trust me, I don't think they would be something we would want in our stew either. Leave it to a koala to think of gum nuts. Dingo laughed and licked his whiskers. Right-o, in they go, and into the gooey, chewy, crunchy, munchy stew, Koala shook lots and lots of gum nuts. Aha! Cried Dingo. Now my stew is missing only one thing. What's that? Asked the animals. That fat wombat. Wait! Stop! Hang on, Dingo. You can't put that wombat into the stew yet. Why not? You haven't tasted it. Right-o, I'll taste it. And that very clever Dingo bent over the billy and took a great big slurp of stew. Abra, phooey! I'm poisoned, he howled. You've all tricked me. And he dashed away deep into the bush, never again to sing, Wombat stew, gooey, brewy, yummy, chewy, wombat stew.